right. So assuming all of your data are in CalPAS and posted in CalPAS, you've cleared all of your submission errors. Then we move on to the certification process, or at least you know the next level of correcting data in CalPAS. So for end of year three, this slide presents basically the workflow to expect for end of year certifications. First, of course, you submit your files. You correct all of the errors in those files, your IVRs, any file format related errors or input validation errors has to be corrected before CalPAS allows you to upload or post the files into the system. So once that's corrected, you then move on to the next level of errors, which is the data discrepancy errors. So right now, since the snapshot is not running yet, we don't have CDDs in the system. So this are your certification errors as well as certification data discrepancy errors that you can see in your snapshot in the certification page. So we implore you to look at your data discrepancy section, because in any data discrepancy that you see in there will, if not corrected, will manifest as CDDs later on when the snapshots are turned on May 6th. So to be proactive, if you've already uploaded your files to CalPADS for end of year three, at least, you may look at your data discrepancies to see any potential errors that you can correct now. All right, so once all of those data discrepancies or even CDDs later on during the snapshot window are corrected, you then move on to review your reports. So it doesn't make sense for you to look at your snapshot reports or certification reports if you still have a handful of errors or a bunch of errors triggered or listed in your snapshots. Because if the students aren't triggering errors, then of course those students are not included on your snapshot reports. So once reviewed your reports, once you've disseminated those reports to attendance folks for the absence summary, or to principals, or to your discipline folks, or even to your SPED folks, or even to your NPS folks, right? So you've disseminated all of those reports of suspensions, of absences, of the RFEPs as well. You may even include your EL folks in this audit. And if they all say, okay, the reports are accurate, then you can then go ahead and proceed with the LEA approval process. Then once you are LEA approved for your district, or LEA is LEA approved, then that would signal the SELPA to also review your reports. Now, if there are any corrections, or if SELPA requests you to make corrections, you can go ahead and do so, submit all of the corrections or post corrections to CalPADS, and then make sure that the revised and certified version is accurate before reapproving. And then, of course, your SELPA will approve as well. So this here is basically a cycle. I mean, once your SELPA approves and they still see later on they encounter some discrepancies, you can go ahead and make corrections and then disapprove and then go through the same process again. So this is just essentially a summary of the work you will expect once the snapshots are available, except for this and this, of course, because you can do that now. All right, so most of the subsequent discussion would be a demo. So let me just bring up here our test site. Let's first go to certification status, right? Because this is where most of the work would be anyway, or not most, well, once the snapshot is active. So for the certification status, you should be able to access this if you have the data certification role and the reports role. Okay. If you don't have that and you are expected to be the person certifying the reports or approving, then ask your CalPADS LE admin or LE administrator to give you that role. If you are the LE admin and you don't have that role, then you have to go to admin and assign that role to yourself. All right, so this is how the certification status looks like. So we are in the test environment. So right now we can see the end of year snapshots now, and it has been running for us in test. So this is how it would look like later on. So I click on end of year certification. So by default, I am still revised uncertified, and so I am also showing that I am uncertified. I have fatal errors and warnings. So if I click on this, it brings me to the student certification details window. All right. So for the certification details, you have here the summary of your default certification revision status. Okay. Currently, I have a revision status of revised uncertified. Okay. And that is what's being presented here. I currently have this status, and then I also have links to the error report. If I have CDDs, I also have a link to download the CDD report extract. I have here the revision create date and revision ID. This represents the current snapshot revision that is available for me. Now, the CDD run is based on the refresh that CalPads did on the data discrepancy section, which I will discuss in a few minutes. So why is this important? If you made corrections to your data discrepancy and you get a new snapshot, but there are still data discrepancies that you still have errors on that snapshot, even though you have a new one, then chances are maybe the snapshot was generated earlier than your data discrepancy refreshing. So you will need to wait for a next snapshot to pick up those updates on the data discrepancy. Okay. And then you also have this box here in review. This would allow you to freeze your this version of the snapshot if you want this to be frozen. So when is this useful? So let's say you did your best to be able to bring down the errors to zero, right? But then you're not ready to certify yet. So you can freeze the data, freeze this version. That way, if there are any changes made into the system, then of course, this specific version of the reports or of this data is frozen while CalPads is still churning or posting or refreshing your any changes you have made. So this will once you check this, this will then be in review, and then any changes later on will be generated with a new revised uncertified snapshot. So you will have an in review status here and a revised uncertified. So I mean, once you've brought down your errors to zero and you're waiting for your folks to review the reports, it's best to check this box, especially sometimes, if we have deployments and we may, introduce potential defects because of that deployment. At least this version is frozen in time and won't be impacted by any defects introduced into the system. All right, so moving down here, you should be able to see who your SELPA is and the status. Obviously, we're in test, so we can associate a SELPA, but your SELPA could be, ABC Unified or Mid City or North City or LA or, El Dorado County Charter. Okay, so that SELPA would be in here. If you are a district who has multiple SELPAs, then you would have multiple SELPAs listed in here as well. And then you have your certification validation. This is where you would see all of your certification errors as well as the CDDs, which are basically data discrepancies that you failed to correct ahead of time. Okay, so essentially, if you go to your data discrepancies, which you can access here, this data discrepancies are essentially a mirror of this. Okay, so it is important that if you've uploaded data now, it is important that you look at the data discrepancy side. That way you can see a more updated or more current version of potential errors that you would need to still correct. Okay, so let's go to this later. So anyway, these are your errors. As you can see, we still have some cert errors here, which only triggers or which only is listed in the certification page. Okay, so anything that starts with cert will only appear here. Anything that has a file type prefix would also appear on the data discrepancy. Right, and then of course you have warnings. So even though these are warnings that it will not prevent you from certifying, I would still look at warnings since there may be potential, errors or potential. These are still potential data discrepancies that you will need to correct in the ODS. Then below here are your certification reports. So for end of year three, you have about, I'm not sure, maybe 13, 14 reports that you will need to review and certify before CalPAS allows you to LEA approve. So once you've reviewed each of this will the red X will become a check mark. And then once you've reviewed all of them, a box will appear here saying, if you check this box, you're signing your life away to CalPADS for life until you retire. Just kidding. So you're just saying that, you agree that all of your data are accurate. And then once you check that box, the LEA approve button will appear, which you can then click on, right? So, I mean, you can just review this. However, of course, you will need to review all of the student list to account for all of the students on the reports. Okay. So we also have the snapshot history. Okay. The snapshot history provides you all of the snapshots, obviously, that was generated for your LEA. So it provides you the revision ID, the status, and then any total records or errors. This is useful for you if you are trying to, if let's say you are already LEA approved and you want your SELPA to be able to look at the revised uncertified version or status that you already corrected. And so you have to just copy the revision ID for that and tell yourself, okay, I've corrected this, but I haven't decertified yet. So would you mind looking at this version of the report? So your SELPA can then look at the reports, filter for your LEA, filter for revised uncertified status, and making sure that the report they're looking at is contains this revision ID. So that way you guys are synchronized or on sync on what data has to be approved. Okay. That's on your side. On our side, this here tells us a story if you guys are working on your data. So let's say if it's been we probably would send you emails telling you, okay, the data, this is just a reminder that you have to correct these errors, blah blah blah. And you know, and then we leave you alone. After a week, we see no progress. After 2 weeks, we see no progress. Then that's where we would then start, getting antsy and just emailing you again and reminding you to do the work because, if you've been a veteran of CalPAS, the last thing you would be doing is, still resolving errors, with during the deadline week because that would be, a headache for you. So this is just a introduction of the user interface for certification details. Of course, once you LEA approved, the SELPA, on the other hand, let me just bring up a SELPA here. So on the SELPA end, this is how it would look like. The reason why I'm picking El Dorado County Charter is because they handle a lot of charter schools. And so this is how it would look on their end. Imagine they have actually this they have this amount of charter schools. that they need to approve and certify. So if you are under El Dorado County Charter, it is important that you get ahead of everyone else. That way you are on the top of the SELPA's list of approvals. So this is how it would look like. So you have your status, the default revision ID, the revision status, and then if you are SELPA approved or certified. So there is also a box here for the SELPA where they could be able to approve their batch approved LEAs. So sometimes you're waiting for El Dorado to approve your end of year 3 or 4. Maybe they're just waiting for just doing a batch approval, and so that could be the reason why the delay is as well. All right, so that's your SELPA user interface. All of my explanation can also be the CalPAS user manual, because on the functionality map and under certification, we provide you a detailed process of certifying. It also provides you some rules with regards to the hierarchy of revisions, because sometimes there are, depending on different scenarios, CalPAS will pick a default revision for your certification status here. So if you have multiple statuses similar to this, CalPAS will pick a specific status to present to you. So if you are LEA approved and you have a revision that you're waiting for, or if you're in review and you need a revision to look at, you need to go back to this revision status and switch the revision. So sometimes, this has been an ongoing issue. Sometimes you are in review or LA approved or SELPA approved, and you want to check if the corrections you've made already happened or generated a new revised uncertified version. Make sure that you click on this, and then there should be a revised uncertified version. Okay. Just be patient when doing this, because CalPads takes a little longer to refresh, and make sure that you have a different revision ID and the revision create date. So there is that. And then there is also, I believe I've embedded it here, a video of more detailed snapshot revision presentation by Nate, as well as another one by Alex. So we have here the CalPAS certification process, the long version and the short version. So you have 25 minutes of Nate's voice and 4 minutes of Alex's voice regarding the cause and effect with regards to switching the revision status. All right, so that's that. So let's go to resolving errors. So again, when resolving errors, obviously you want to go to your instinct is to go to your certification status, right? Certification status page, going to end of year and looking at the search status here. So that's fine. I mean, you have all of your cert errors, you have your CDD errors. However, since you are not, or the snapshots haven't been activated yet for you to be able to access this, we recommend that you go to the data discrepancy section to see potential errors that you need to correct based on the existing records you have in CalPADS right now for end of year 3. Okay, so we have here data discrepancies. So data discrepancies are essentially the next level of errors that trigger based on all of the posted records you have in CalPADS. Okay, so you have your IVR, and then you have your data discrepancy. And then if that data discrepancy has not been resolved proper amount of time, then it will manifest as a CDD here. Okay. Right. So since we're resolving errors, let me just demo some of the errors that we think you will encounter for end of year three. Okay, so number one would be cert one. Let's just go to the certification errors. So you have cert one. Once you have your snapshots activated on May 6th and you see a cert one and it pertains to a school that had no students this year and CalPADS still had it in the expected schools table, we highly recommend that you reach out to CalPADS, send in a service ticket asking us to exclude the school from the expected schools table. We highly recommend that you do that as soon as the snapshots are activated on May 6th. Provide CDE some time to be able to update it because normally CDE would have to go into their database, update it, and then it takes a new snapshot before it clears. So, between CDE, between your email to CalPADS for help, CDE updating it, CalPADS generating it, a new snapshot, it might take you days. So we highly implore you that if you see cert 001, please make sure that you have sent up a request right away to have the school taken off from your expected schools list. Now, if you have a cert 1 and this school is active, then that means you have not submitted any data to CalPAS in relation to end of year 3 yet. So by all means, start uploading files and that should help you with clearing those errors. But at this point of the year, since this is now end of year three and you haven't submitted any SENR, so that majority of these cert ones are based on schools that have been closed that were still included on the expected schools table. Okay. All right, so let's go back to the data discrepancies and demo some errors. So So you have here the data discrepancy. Nate has a detailed demo with regards to data discrepancy in CalPADS. Let me see here. If you go to the CalPADS user manual and click on functionality map and data discrepancies, his video is here. So you can watch it. And then there are some details here as well listed for data discrepancies. And you can also look for it in the YouTube channel directly. So what are data discrepancies? These are actually errors, next level errors that you have to resolve based on existing records in CalPAD. So let's look at one error here. Let's look at E150 exit requires new enrollment at same school within 1 day. So I picked this error because I had an LEA a few days ago who had this issue. So let's look at this one student. So when resolving errors, there are you have to have multiple resources ready for you. One is the CalPADS error list, which you could download here. We're now in version 16.16, and we will be deploying 16.17 soon. Another one is just by clicking on the error itself here, error number. When you click on this, it would then bring up a web-based version of the error list. I recommend you do this instead because number one, it's there. You just click it, it brings it up, and if there are any active defects on this, you would be able to see it right away, rather than starting to figure out your error, and then it turns out the issue is a defect in the system. Okay. All right. So let's resolve this student. So SENR 0286E3 E150 exit requires new enrollment at the same school within 1 day. So I click on the SSID and I see this. So I have here Shenandoah. Okay. So it turns out I exited the student with an E150. Okay. Let's see the definition. So it says here, if exit code equals E150, then the enrollment start date at the same school cannot be greater than 1 day after enrollment exit date. So what does this mean? So if you are telling us that the student has an E150 code exit for this enrollment, maybe because there's a grade change, or maybe there's a change in the grade level, or the enrollment status, or geographic residence, then of course that's a valid E150 exit. Now, if not, then maybe this student has to be exited with a different code, right? So looking at this, it turns out the student was exited at Emerson and then enrolled at Eleanor Murray by Dublin. So that means this code should not be an E150. What code should I use here? So this should be a T160 because the student is transferring, correct, is transferring to a different LEA or a different school. If it's within the same district, if the student transferred to a different school, you still have to use an a T160. Okay, so that is how to analyze this. You have to make sure that the student is exited with the proper exit, and that should resolve the issue. So if I change this to a T160, then of course that should clear the error. Now, there are instances where it is a valid E150. Okay, there are instances where it is a valid E150, or maybe, you know, the student was moving from one school to another. So this is also a scenario where you can't use an E150 if the student moved to a different school within your district. Okay. How do you report a valid E150? So if a student had, an internal change in their enrollment record, but the student is still at the district, there should be a subsequent next day enrollment at the same school. So if this is 827, then this one would be 828, which is correct. However, the school of attendance should be the same as Emerson Elementary. Now, we always have pushback from LEA stating that, hey, we can't do that because we've exited the student on a Friday. You can use a Saturday, right? So our advice to you guys is that you may need to exit the students on a Thursday and add the Friday enrollment. Or you can exit the student on a Monday and then add a Tuesday enrollment. Either way, if it's a weekend, then it should be on a weekday sequence. So it's either a Thursday, Friday, or a Monday, Tuesday. Okay? That's how to resolve a SCNR 286E3. So let's go back here. And of course, we have a lot of ELAS not reported. So this is your CERT 67 before. We also have invalid race missing indicator. Okay, let's move on. Students enrolled record in active reporting year not exited, 25. Okay, so let's look at this. Student enrolled record in active year not exited yet. Since you guys are still, have active enrollments, you have not submitted your SENR yet, expect this to happen until you've submitted your student enrollment exits at the end of the year. Okay, that's just that. And then missing overlapping synth record. So obviously you have a synth record that you need to submit to CalPADS. You also have missing student summary data for student. Okay, let's click on this. So this pertains to your STAS file. So if you have not submitted your STAS file yet, obviously if you have 100 students, then of course you'll have 100 errors, right? So to clear this, submit a batch task file to CalPAS at the end of the year once you've ascertained the absence summary, absence counts of all of your students. Submit that file to CalPADS, and that should clear it, right? And so now, I mean, you can potentially submit STAS files to CalPADS right now just to see if there are any discrepancies that CalPADS sees with regards to your STAS records. Just do know that the STAS file is a replacement file processing. And so if you're submitting a STAS at the same school for the same student, and then later on submit a new file, it will overwrite the old file, which is good, right? Since you are trying to just overwrite the data. Okay. So for this, it's just stating that you have a missing STAS file for this student. So let's look at this. We go to STAS, and true enough, you have that error. All right, so let's move on to the next one here. So you have here mismatch of student incident attributes. Sync 0516E3. So this happens when you submitted a sync record for different students who share the same incident ID. Okay. So let's look at these two records. So the error states that for any incident occurrence, for any incident ID, the incident occurrence date must always be equal in all records with the same incident ID local. So if you submitted a record at the same school of attendance, same academic year ID, and they're sharing the same ID, local incident ID, then the occurrence date should also be the same. So this happens normally if you're manually adding students into CalPAS incident records, and you have incorrect incident dates, or you essentially created an incident. However, you submitted multiple varying occurrence dates for the same students involved at the same incident. Okay, so let's look at those two errors being that's causing this issue. Okay, so you have your incident ID bad boy 001. Okay, so for backcountry, we go to incident results, and then we go to this for baloney skin. We have here incident result 2. So see how these two are sharing the incident ID local, the same school, right? But look at the occurrence date. One is 10/2/2024. The incident happened on Census Day this year, while the other is March 3, 2025. Okay? So here are your questions. Are these the same incident? Number one, if they are not the same incident, then by all means change the incident ID local for one of these records. Because you can be sharing a generic incident ID for different incidents, right? That occurred. Number two, if these are the same incident, then of course change the occurrence date to match when the incident actually happened. So let's say this may have an occurrence date of 3/3/2025, maybe because the secretary thinks that, oh, okay, we've finally made a decision and suspended the students on 3/3. So they put 3/3/2025, right? And so now that creates a discrepancy. So if that's the case, always tell your school secretaries to mark the occurrence date for that incident properly. So two things, either these two are the same incident. If that's the case, make sure that the occurrence date matches. Now, if these two are different incidents, then change the local incident ID for one of those records. Okay, so that's that. And then we have another one here. Ah, expected attendance days greater than total enrollment days. So let's click on that. So we have here STAS 0707E3. So what does this error say? So the expected attendance days is greater than total enrollment days. The error description. A student's expected attendance days must be less than or equal to their enrollment days at the same school for the same academic year. Okay? So meaning your attendance day should be shorter than the total calendar days based on the enrollment start date, right? So that's how it is computed. And how do we resolve this? Of course, we go to the student triggering the error. We have here Shenandoah. We look at the STAS record. And you already submitted a STAS record of 180 total attendance days and 10 10 absence days. Okay. However, CalPAS couldn't figure out if this is correct or not. Why? Because there is no reference point on computing this. Why? Because look at this. So the student was there on April 21 and then this as well, right? So what this means is that you're claiming that the student had a full 180 calendar days at the district. However, we can figure out because there is no endpoint here, right? So this happens for students who joined you later part in the year, and then you've submitted the STAS file ahead of the SENR exit. So by default, if you submit a STAS file ahead of the SENR exit, CalPADS will use May 15 as the cutoff point. And so if that's the case, it's not 180. And if you add the total here, it's not even, 180 as well. So that's the point. If you have students who entered the school at the end of the year, then expect the attendance days to trigger this error until you've exited the student. However, if you've exited the student and you still have the error, how do you then resolve this issue? Well, you have to compute the enrollment days properly, right? So there is a duration days calendar calculator that you could use and count the expected days. So we started what? 415, right? For April 21. So April 21, and then let's say you ended on 6:30. 6 6:16. And then include end date in calculation, count only work days, and then calculate duration. So based on that April 15 enrollment start date, and you've calculated your end date as June 16, CalPAD should only have 40 days of attendance days. Your staff should only have the maximum 40 days of attendance days. Okay. Now, if you add, of course, you also have this enrollment. If you add that too, then it's probably just a month or maybe 20, 25 days tops that you need to add here. So technically, this might be 65 days and it still is lower than your claim of 180 days. So bottom line is your calculations were wrong. Okay. So make sure that you make the changes in CalPads, wait for a new snapshot to generate or a new data discrepancy refresh, and that should clear the error here. So what did I do? We had to make sure that the calendar days are correct. Now, if again, as a reminder, if your LEA were impacted by calamities like the fires, obviously your expected days would be lower and you have to adjust accordingly as well with the days of attendance and the total days of expected days in CalPads. All right, that's for that error. And I have one last. Okay, missing suspension data for a student. So it says here you have a missing suspension for a student who you claim to be absent based on suspension. So let's look at this again. It's Shenandoah. We go to her student absence summary. And true enough, I have 3 days, 2 days of out of school, 1 day of in school. So I go to incident result and I don't have any data to justify this suspension. Okay. So how did I know to look at this? Obviously, we have to go back to here and go to the error. So what this is stating that if you are reporting a suspension, it could be in school or out of school, then CalPAS expect an incident, a sync, and a Sears, and of course SOF, but it will just look for the incident results because that's where the days are included, the sync and Sears, uh, to justify a suspension. Okay. So this normally happens if, let's say, you submitted your stats ahead of your sync Sears soft file. It could be a timing issue. Number two, um, it could be, you submitted all files, but you missed the sync Sears soft of this one student. So it could be just an error on your part. Or it could also be that there was never, you probably reported suspension days improperly, so there couldn't have been any suspension, so you clear this and then you adjust the attendance days accordingly. Or maybe this student was suspended, the incident occurred last year, so between April 15 and the last day of school, Nate thought that probably at the last day of school he could get back at me for stealing his girlfriend last day of school and he won't be suspended, right? Nope, he's not scot free. So essentially the incident happened last day of school of 23-24. However, the suspension was implemented at the first few days of the new academic year. And so that's what this could be a reason for that issue. So again, of course, you still have to report the incident last year. Okay. So bottom line is if there was an incident last year from April 15 up to the last day of school, there should still be an incident result to account for that incident. So you can't justify an out of school suspension if there are no incidents so the student is associated to. So that's basically what this error is. So what does this demo say? If you're new to CalPads, number one, don't be pressured to know everything because you won't know everything. Trust me, I've been in CalPads since 2011, and I could barely, we're still learning. So the secret to CalPads troubleshooting and CalPads success is just knowing where to find the resources at. Yeah, the pressure is there, but you can manage it, right? um, so the bottom line here is that knowing where to find the answers. And how do you do that? By going to the system documentation that Nate mentioned, all of the survival kits, and the user manual, the YouTube channel, and then of course our handy dandy, Google search. If I say stability rate calculation CDE, you have a summary by the AI overview here, and you have some different links you could do. Harness the power of search, not just within CalPAS, but the internet. So there's always an answer. It's just a matter of searching for it. If for some reason you couldn't figure it out, you can always send in a service ticket to CalPAS, and we would hopefully be able to provide you the answers. Or if it's an internal question that involve an SIS, make sure that you are subscribed to the listserv, and you could probably ask your question on the listserv. Okay. So once you've resolved those issues, of course, you're ready to review the reports, and that's my time to pass on the mic to Nate for the report descriptions and other explanations on reviewing reports.